Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host for this episode. My name is Kripa Koshy. As some of you may know, I'm a program manager here at Takshashila. And today we are hoping to discuss India's labor codes that have caught a little bit of attention or a fair bit of attention, let's say, in mainstream media. And so my hope is by chatting with our guest today, we'll be able to unpack some of the considerations that have been floating around on these new codes. But before I jump into that, I'm going to say welcome to our guest and do a formal introduction. Hello, Pankil. First of all, welcome to ATP. Lovely to have you.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, great, Pankil. So I'm just going to do the formal introduction bit so folks know what occupies a lot of your time when you're not recording a podcast with us. So right. Pankil Goswami is a PhD candidate at the School of Social Work at McGill University. He's interested in researching the informalization of work through labor market flexibility, the consequence of precarious working conditions among people who typically work at the bottom of the informal economy. His PhD thesis, as I understand, examines the intricacies related to the access of welfare policies for migrant construction workers in Western India. So his teaching and research is primarily interdisciplinary, which is great, I think, actually, Pankil, because it gives us a really rich perspective. And it focuses on labor, social policy, work and employment, and the transformation of the welfare state. So a lot of important and busy things that you're occupied with, Pankil, but thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks once again for sending in the invitation.
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful for our listeners, Pankil. I was thinking if I put a little bit of context down, and then I'll just turn to you to sort of share some of your views and maybe even what brought you to this area of research a little bit. So earlier in the year, we know that some have followed that the Labour Minister met with some of his counterparts to spur the finalization of some draft rules for 4 labour codes, which have been, again, like I said, caught a lot of media attention. So these 4 codes that we're talking about were passed initially by Parliament in 2019-20, as I understand. And now really these codes the intention was to merge about 29 existing labor laws into 4 broad categories, which, as I understand, are wage, social security, industrial relations, and then occupational safety, health, and working conditions. So there was this intention that was announced by the union government that, implementations should begin across states by the 1st of April. So this is sort of a timely discussion a few weeks out from that. The codes were supposed to ensure universalisation of wages, social security, ensuring a safe and healthy workplace, formalising employment a little bit, wants for higher female labour force participation, skill development. So a bunch of different objectives really and why these codes were put out there. But my hope is in our time together, we can sort of explore what the implementation of these codes would look like, and then particularly trying to pay attention to the informal sector where we know that, there, according to recent estimates as of last year, the number sits at about 110 million workers who are a part of India's informal sector. So with that, I'm going to start maybe by asking you a very broad question here, Pankil. So at maybe a high level, what do you think are some of the roadblocks that you might see when these 4 labor codes are now being implemented?
Let's start by, flipping the script and maybe asking a question that do people understand what these labor codes are, and do even specialists and technical people or people who are concerned with it, trade union leaders and aligned persons, organizers, community organizers, these kind of people, do they understand or what are the technicalities of it, what are the repercussions of it, or what are the implications, positive and negative both. So I feel there is a lot of, even within trade union circle, there's a lot of ambiguity related to deconstructing what they actually mean. It's the meaning of these codes. Okay, you want to do the state government, like the central government wants to do a codification, which is in hindsight a good exercise because India is a complex web of laws and you want to codify it. It's not a bad intention as per se, but then if you critically look at it, what impact is it making in a good way or in a bad way? Because law per se and labor per se is such a huge, vast ocean, right? And there are subsets of like small clauses to which, and then the workers will ask, or the trade union leaders will ask themselves, depending on which type of, for example, if someone is working on welfare, so for them the code on social security will be more important to engage with. If someone is working on the occupational health and safety, for them, what are the provisions of where precarious working conditions are reduced, that is in safety. So I feel there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of lack of clarity also, because the case of India is also very ironical that you have 90% of the population which works in an informal economy, but you have all the trade unions which are mostly into formalized sectors. At different railway stations, the railway Mazdoor Sanghs and all that. And then one realizes railways is like considered to be like a very safe, secure jobs. And you have unions there, you have unions in the public sector units and Indian oil corporations. But a worker who's selling something on the streets of Bengaluru or New Delhi might not have any union. But a construction worker who is working on different sites across India, who has maybe traveled to 10 to 12 different provinces or states, does not have any union. So then one thinks, like, again, this is a topic within a topic. So again, coming back to, again, the major question is, one doesn't understand what is the repercussion. There's an ambiguity. There are some clauses within different codes which have raised reservations on the ability to hire and fire, the more flexibilization of work and employment relationship, the more intention towards all the governments. I would not say particularly any one particular government, but all the governments since 1991 have tried a more ease of doing business kind of a target, which thinks is the way for economic growth. So, yeah, and there is a lack of social dialogue. Even within this formalized unions, people don't, or trade union leaders don't feel that it was done via consultation, and hence the anxieties and hence the ambiguity. So it's a lot of confusion, and it's difficult also, I understand, from the end of the government, because India is not a homogeneous country. You have different provinces and you have different unions, although there are big major unions whom you can bring on the table. But then a fierce critic would argue then the person who is who's standing last at the queue, his or their voice is still not heard. Right. So I think it's about anxiety. It's more about lack of social dialogue. It's more about why we were not consulted, or how much of, or even if we were consulted, how much of our opinions were put on table. And in a general sense of lack of a lot of information, I feel.
That's a really good point, I think. So that seems like a core concern where, if you're talking about implementing this, it helps if you have all the stakeholders implicated by it come alongside and understand really what this could mean. And I know, something that we touched on previously was the fact that essentially this is almost like you maybe have said, like this codification consolidation process of existing acts and laws that already have been out there, right? So for example, the occupational safety, health and working conditions code is intended to replace like the Factories Act, the Contract Labor Act and all of these things. So if you're able to sort of comment on it again at maybe a high level, there clearly were some of these regulations in place or guidance and lines sort of in place, and yet there have been possibly challenges in implementing some of that, right? So are there does this codification process help overcome some of the challenges maybe that previous iterations of these acts may have had?
I think the codes provide an important avenue and opportunity for workers and importantly trade union leaders to democratically come together and engage with the government in a more constructive way of Even their rules are there. For example, you have minimum wages rules. If you go and you see how much is the implementation. So when already rules are there and then there is lack of effective implementation, how does codification going to enforce a more robust implementation? You need to go back to the institutions like the Directorate of Industrial Health and Safety, and you need to look at these institutions and their performance, and you need to really, and this is not only about, I'm not talking about the central government, I'm talking about respective state governments, their inclination towards what is their attitude, what is their particular own political stand or attitude towards the work and employment relations in their own province. For example, Kerala would have a very different sensibilities and orientations in comparison to Gujarat, right? West Bengal will have a lot of different orientations in comparison to Maharashtra. So can you, even if you have coded, okay, everything is done, even if you consider the best case scenario that, okay, all the codes are good, or, apart from a few mismanagement, apart from a few poorly drafted codes, some of them have good aspects, some of them have bad aspects. But then how do you institutionalize it in a more effective way? That's the basic question. That's more a question of enforceability. There's a more question of administration.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's part of some of the I guess criticism sometimes it's been leveled against this, that, is there, as much as we think that this is presenting an opportunity to have a more fundamental sort of discussion around some of this, that it only goes so far, because there are some struggles that need to be accounted for that right now are not being considered, I guess, in the discourse. So a lot of commentators might even say that, some of the changes that are being proposed here are already happening maybe with state level amendments. So what's the point of having now this new codification process? Because the struggle ultimately is that implementation side, right? Like no matter what form it may take, if it's the struggle is at implementation, then that's a bigger conversation to have. So I think another piece that I want to sort of double click on that you had sort of shared earlier, which is the idea of consultation, right? That a criticism that's come around when these codes are being formulated even was that consultations were not really tripartite in nature. So could you give some of your thoughts on that? If we could go a little bit deeper there, like, is it one, maybe a proposed solution to how to respond to some of those concerns that have come up? And even if that participation was not tripartite in the drafting of the codes themselves, could the implementation process be where these voices might be heard a little bit probably louder?
Yeah, I think it's, again, to go back at a very basic level, it's also a question of organizing workers, right? You have a country where maybe, I don't know which other country, maybe China, but you don't have any other country where 90% of the workforce works in an informal economy, yet you cannot organize them. That's the irony. Yet you cannot forget about 90%, but you cannot even bring 5 to 10% of those 90% to a platform for an agitation, right? It's a mess. And if you can do that, then any state government or any central government will listen to labor. But because there's a lack of ability to organize, or the political economy of work and employment relations is so entrenched in, or the way capitalism is running in our societies is so normalized, that this possibility is itself a task. So once you can organize people, once you can bring at least, I don't know, like even 2% of your informal workers of the state to the state's capital, then I'm sure the governments will be happy to hear you, to bring you on board. But it can't happen because, I don't know how this will sound, but because there's a lack of, I would not say all, but there's a lack of consciousness among the working poor about what they are supposed to have and what they're supposed to do. I'm not talking of from a moral value judgment point of view. I'm talking more of meeting workers, understanding, going into interiors, talking to people about what do they require, and genuinely people would, a lot of time people, especially women, would say whatever government gives us is fine, right? If you don't have a conscious or an awake worker, then everything falls apart, right? It's very difficult to you can initiate a dialogue, and I'm sure very many abled organizations, individuals have spent their life and decades in India doing that, and they are still doing that. But they themselves would say this point, that if workers are organized in a better way and they ask for their rights and they practice democracy in a more peaceful way, then the government or any state or central government would be happy to hear them.
Right. Yeah. I completely understand where you're coming from. I think there is a sense of, not reasonably, maybe even knowing what can you expect from the state, and what can you hold the state accountable for. Some of those fundamental questions need to kind of be asked. So I know we're circling a little bit around the issue of particular needs that informal workers may have, right? But I think it might be helpful for the listener for us to maybe explicitly name some of that. So I know that you've been doing a little bit of research where you've had the opportunity to hear directly from some of these segments of the informal sector, where you've been able to hear what their specific concerns are. So what would you say you've been hearing about some of the struggles that these workers have been facing, that states are not able to they feel that states are not sufficiently able to respond to yet?
I feel some of them are the usual suspects, like precarious working conditions, not safe working environment, in informal working relations, informal lived lives across big cities. You see how people live in informal settlements. It's unforgiving, to say the least, where and how people live and work. And with climate change, we have very difficult weathers like 45, 46, 47, and workers work there. More importantly, if you go and ask any street vendor, they will not know what a labor code is, or they might have heard about labor code, but they won't know what will we get out of it. They will ask you. Well, you are saying I'm still trying to figure it out myself, right? So is there a clause? So just to be more specific and more precise about informal workers welfare board and stuff like that, and under the Code of Social Security, I think in 2007, you already had an unorganized workers welfare board. This is a more kind of a system which comes from states like Tamil Nadu, which have developed for different professions, different welfare board, and then they run some welfare schemes, and it is seen a recognition of their rights, of their welfare. And it's also a way to democratically make voters more, how do I say it, like more loyal to their political base, right? Because we will give, so you vote for this, that kind of welfarism. That is what we've been seeing, electoral welfarism. But even if a board is formed, the technical aspect with informal worker is like, for example, in construction, you have a construction board, which was there in 1996, Building and Other Construction Workers Welfare Board Act, which is continued because obviously construction is the big industry. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of connections between the political parties and the election, like the real estate. And you need workers to build modern India, right? You're not even building modern India, repairing modern India. You're making infrastructure, whether it's rail, it's real estate. So you need workers. So construction is a high-stake industry, and through an act like Building and Other Construction Workers Welfare Board, you realize that, okay, a construction company can pay a cess of 1 or 2%, and then you can run welfare schemes, and then you can recognize construction workers and make a specific act out of it. But who will fund informal workers? Because you have street vendors, you have rickshaw drivers, you have, you name it, you have like agricultural workers, you have urban, all kind of self-employed people, from where will you bring money for this huge chunk of informal workers for the state to run policies? Because at the end, even if the state has a desire, it needs financial amount, it needs some dedicated resources that we are going to dedicate this much amount to informal workers. And how do you decide who's an informal worker? Tomorrow I'm doing something, and tomorrow, like for example, because construction is such high profile and it's also more politicized, and there's also like a long history, they've made the rules very flexible. Okay, that I can give an affidavit, I've worked in this construction site, and then I can avail benefits. But there are numerous informal professions, like going into the sea and catching a fish, for example, or selling something on the streets, or doing domestic work or cleaning someone's houses. If you create a list of occupation, I'm sure there must be at least minimum 25 to 30 such occupations. And how do you then recognize it? I'm not telling it's not possible, but it requires administrative willpower, administrative thought, political willpower, and a lot of people who spend their lives doing this work to sit together and draft ways. Okay, if you have created an informal workers welfare board, then this is how we are going to identify this is an informal worker, this is the amount we are going to pay. And you can expect a rush of people coming in, because you have essentially an economy where 90% are in informal economy.
Yeah.
So it's very complicated, to be honest, but it's still possible.
Right, absolutely. But it's good to be clear-eyed about some of this, right? Like as much as it can be proposed as a potential solution to be able to mobilize workers, to be able to give more visibility to workers in a certain way, it's good to, I think, be pragmatic about what would still be some of the struggle points here, right? So I know one of the things that you flagged here was, funding it being a concern. So would you say then ultimately that, having greater funding from state governments for such welfare boards to be set up is ultimately what you think could serve informal workers well? And then maybe a related question of, if let's say these boards are set up, what is sort of the best way even for workers to hold these boards accountable? Because as you mentioned, there are so many struggles that a board might face in trying to sustain itself and just even stay afloat. So sort of just two parts to the question. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. Even let's say in best case scenario, central government provides a fund that's not sustainable, to be honest. You can't have a welfare board run on funds for a 90% or an 80% population who works in an informal economy, because the sustainability of such a fund would be question mark, because you have a market economy, right? Construction workers welfare board functions because construction is booming and the money is provided by the real estate agencies through law.
Sure.
But you don't have such a common, unique way in other informal workers' profession. The other thing would be if you deduct money from informal workers and then give them welfare, but how would you deduct money to a person who is living hand to mouth?
Right.
How do you, from which moral ground will you go and tax a person who is struggling to make ends meet? You know?
I hear that.
So then you need to really go back to a particular states. I don't know, like I can talk about, for example, like I know in sense Tamil Nadu has a history of running such welfare boards and creating a mechanism. But again, Tamil Nadu has a strong history of political movements, of pro-poor kind of
of workers.
voting happens, a lot of these issues. So that's why it's possible. That might not function in my province, for example, in Gujarat, because the political sensitivity and the history of the political economy, the social fabric of the state is very different from, like, say, Tamil Nadu.
Sure.
It's very difficult for even for a person like me who's still studying this to understand that how do you fund these mechanisms. Even if government or particular state government starts putting, let's say, 4, 5, 600 crores aside, depending on the population size and depending on, then you can start it somehow by doing something. But then there is a question of sustainability. But it is still, I would say, possible. You need to, the businesses or whoever is earning through informal economy needs to be taxed in a more progressive way, where they feel that, okay, our money is going back to the people or it's coming back to us. We don't have such a mechanism. Because even if right now you ask informal workers that can you donate 2,000 rupees every year to this welfare board, they might do that but they might want to have a higher accountability of what are you going to do of that 2,000, and even if you run, let's say, some welfare schemes, my point is, even if you run some welfare schemes, can they change their life course? That's a different question.
Can it fundamentally alter the struggles that a worker in that particular segment of society is struggling with? Yeah.
So it comes back to structural issues of how do you respect your workers, how work is formalized. And it's also funny that we have a country where, again, 85% of our informal, but a lot of work, a lot of talk about a lot of research goes about that 50% huge chunk of privilege who work in corporates. Although they have also their work and employment issues. I don't say that their workplace is very nice, but I'm sure it is better than the person who does not know where his next meal is going to come from. Right? So yeah, ultimately, even if you set up these welfare boards, an ideal, it's a long journey, but let's say you set up an informal workers welfare board, which is suggested what is in the code, and you follow something like construction workers welfare board, but that can it substantially elevate the living standard or life capacity of these workers?
Yeah, that is the bigger question ultimately. It's a moot exercise if that's not the outcome it can promise. Yeah.
But it cannot promise that outcome because it's a market economy with winners and losers. Someone has to lose if someone's to win.
There's an inherent struggle in how the system might be set up.
And we have a system where 10 people are winners and 90% are, I would not say So let's say 10 are winners, 30 are somewhere in between, and maybe 50 or 60 are like unsatisfied people. Or because we have a complex system, a socio-economic fabric also, that you belong to a particular community or belong to a particular geographical place that decides that how much struggle you will go through in your life.
Yeah, some of these are, constraints and constraining factors that are sometimes a challenge to break out of, right? Like, it does feel like it imposes a fair bit of sway in sort of how your standard of living might look, and some of these factors. But I just want to come back to, the example that, we've touched on briefly, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, as being two states that have been cited in the past as, examples of where, these welfare worker boards do exist. Do you think there are some best practices from either context that you think should be held on to as a sort of a good example for such boards? And again, operating the premise that, a welfare board would still ultimately offer some value to an informal worker. Are there lessons you think from those two contexts that could be pulled?
I feel how the act of BUCW came in 1996 was through a long legal battle, a long democratic process of asking for the governments to recognize our rights. And at the end of the day, in 1996, this law came. So with unorganized welfare board, you already have a construction workers welfare board whom you can closely look up to. Okay, there's a but then the nature of, although construction is also an industry, is a lot of informality because there's subcontracts, there is also a violation of wages at a lot of level, there's also exploitation of workers. But still, in spite of all that, somehow a mechanism has been created where every state government and the central government recognizes you are a construction worker, and just in this based on the model welfare scheme with the central government of India has devised, that every state will draw its own welfare scheme. Okay, we will give you this, we will give you this, which a lot of, to be honest, again, we are talking about freebies now. Some people call it freebies. A more market oriented economist would not agree to giving freebies, but then at least it gives some respite. A women construction worker who works on a construction site till the 8th month of her pregnancy will have some respite if a state government board gives her 37,000 rupees in her bank account. It's some respite has been given. But then, so yeah, informal workers can start looking from the construction workers welfare board, that can we create a list of professions, and can we create a more homogeneous single board who caters to XYZ professions, and under these XYZ professions, these common welfare schemes are available. And these common welfare schemes would be nothing very big, but something which is already implemented, like an educational scholarship for the children, maternity benefits, occupational and health safety, employee allowances. Because right now, if I'm an informal worker and I fall sick or I face accident, I don't get any compensation. I'm literally on my own. And then you still see a fertility rate among poor people as having 4 children, 5 children. And then we ask them, why do you produce so many kids? Because they don't have any pension. They don't have any stock markets earning after the age of 60 to rely on. So they produce kids. One thing leads to the other thing leads to other. And it's a very complex cycle of, and it's also the problem, or I don't know, the good or the bad thing with India is it's such a complex, big country with over 1 billion population that you don't have such examples in other part of the world also.
Sure.
Right?
It's so unique in its context, yeah.
It's so unique in its context, and what we are talking about is each Indian province is equivalent to a Western democratic country, of European country. For example, my own home province has more population than the entire population of a lot of European countries, even Canada. So it's insane the number of people are in that you are talking about. It's just gigantic, but you also have the resources. If people are more, you can't just say, oh, we have a lot of population. So means you have a lot of resources.
Right.
So I don't know whether I have, through these responses, I have complicated the issue, but I've just tried to touch on some of the macro aspects as well as micro aspect, that it's, you might bring labor codes, you might bring laws, but essentially at the end of the day, these are the main questions which you will come down to. Can you some respite? Can you reduce precarious working conditions? Can you reduce accidents on work sites, which we have so much normalized that people fall from their height? It's quite normal. So it's very difficult to obtain data, but how many workers die annually in India? How many would die? I think minimum minimum easily, I guess, 15 to 20,000 workers would die annually or more than that, which is a big number. Just out of falling from height, an accident which have could been avoided.
Hmm.
It's not some rocket science, right? It's such basic.
Yeah, but it's good to be, like you said, mindful of like the complexities that are involved, and the context in which some of these codes will have to play out. Like it's a very appealing idea, right, to say that if we can just codify things into four broad categories, it simplifies, allows for the simplification of a rather complex milieu actually that's being operated under. And then there are all these very specific sort of calls for expectations of how to regulate employment conditions and things like that within each of these codes, right? And so the ambition of it, I think, like you'd said earlier on in the conversation, is admirable, and the intention might be, yeah, very well intended. But yeah, when you get down to the brass tacks, there are some very practical challenges that will have to be considered. I think in that vein, maybe I think since we might not have too much time together, I'm just wondering if there were sort of, two or three sort of big ideas that you think would be useful to reflect on, even for listeners, and because we've covered a little bit of ground over here. But do you think if there's something that you'd sort of point to as good to keep in mind as we're interpreting how some of these codes will unfold?
Yeah, I think so. The basic question at the end of the day is, how do we bring informal workers into a formal foray? Right? But some might celebrate the informality, say that's the nature of our cities, that's the nature of our lives, why you want to formulate it, right? But then it's also, you want to have a more stable income. You want to have, I'm not telling that anywhere you have it. Of course, in the West, you have layoffs, you have people living on the edge, you have people becoming homeless in a matter of months or, a few weeks if their if the balance sheet goes off. But how do you recognize, for example, a lot of people say that, okay, you have done this construction welfare board, it has not altered the situation, but there is a recognition that these are workers and these are important. So in same way, informal workers, there has to be some recognition along with specific occupations, because you have a sea of occupations, as I said, from a domestic worker to a street vendor to a rickshaw driver to a factory worker to a coastal worker. There are n number of professions which they are all contributing to the economy.
Correct.
Right, all contributing to the economy, and you want to go very good into ease of doing business. That's great, but is it translating into the life of a person, that ease of doing business? That's also a component that we need to have a look at it. So yeah, the labor codes will come the way it looks like, and it's going to be implemented, but the real implication on how positive they are, or what good things are there, or what loopholes are there, will only be realized once it's officially implemented across it.
Yeah. Right.
And in fact, I feel, sorry, but I feel that unions will also understand its more impact once they're implemented. Of course, they have a lot of reservations with some of the good and some of the bad aspects, but then once it becomes a law, and then you see its implications, its ramifications, its consequences, its good things, then you can now gauge. Often you don't know how it's going to pan out unless it pans out.
Right.
But I acknowledge that there are some aspects which are, could be better drafted, or there are some aspects which are good. For example, recognition of gig workers and stuff like that.
Yes.
I think it's not wrong. In Karnataka, recently they made a gig workers welfare board, right? That's also interesting. That can it regulate the platform economy?
Yeah, and like you said, time will tell for some of these bigger questions. But I think I'm glad that the codification process has at the very least resurfaced some of these concerns, which there have been unions that have been very vocal and have been very enthusiastic about sharing some of those views. But with some of these developments, it presents once again an opportunity for people to raise the profile of the issue, to allow for some conversation to happen, to revisit maybe persistent ills in this process as well. So yeah, I do absolutely hear so there is some uncertainty around some of it, and yet it's sort of an important space to watch. So with that, actually, Pankil, I'm going to draw our conclusion to a close. Not like we said earlier, there's so many complexities to it, and we could continue the chat, I know, and explore a little bit further. But because of time, we'll restrict our conversation here, and also because of we'll have to wait and see how some of this plays out. I just want to thank you so much for your time, for your insights and perspective. I think it's been really helpful, and my hope is even for our listeners that it sort of piqued their interest and allowed them built some curiosity to be able to follow this issue themselves, to come at it with a slightly more informed perspective, and for them to better understand the context as well, which I think you really laid out really well. So thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, sending the invitation. And I think what we've discussed is just the tip of the iceberg. It's for someone to initiate a thought in their own minds about this entirely big topic. And because I feel how much we need to write or think about it, it's not received that much due recognition.
It's true. It needs a little more opportunity, I think, there needs to be more of an unpacking of it, because there are so many layers to this that it needs that type of attention and time. And so, which is why I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.